All right, guys, what is up? We are going to be talking about the progressive era today, specifically focusing on muckrakers. So, today's aims or objectives is students can identify how muckrakers influence change in American society. So, our task today is to do the progressive era intro notes and guided note taking sheet. So, over here is the guided note taking sheet. So, using this educational clip, the one you're watching now, please complete the following guided note taking sheet. You may pause the video and record information as you are watching. Look for questions at the bottom of the charts anytime we do a guided note taking sheet. So you'll notice the first couple things that you're going to define is the progressive era, muckrakers, and you're going to listen to me talk about a series of reforms that you will need to know for your quiz or upcoming test at the end of the week. And you're going to tell me out of those reforms, which one did you think impacted America the most? And you're going to explain in 3 sentences. Then these are the muckrakers we're going to be talking about. You will record notes like what work did they produce, whether it was political cartoons or maybe it was a book, what was the subject they focused on, and what was the result or outcome. And I'm going to try to do this really fast. So again, here we go. So give it a second to go to present mode and we will get started today. So today's compelling question is, how did muckrakers produce change? So, muckrakers were people who tried to rake up the muck of society. They tried to bring to our attention, okay, the corruption and the problems, and they wanted to produce change. But a lot of Americans didn't know how to produce change. A lot of Americans couldn't read. So it took a lot of gumption and a lot of hard work to be able to inform the American public of what's going on, because back then there was no instant access to social media. There was only newspapers and magazines. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So, what is the progressive era? It was a period of widespread social activism and political reforms across the United States that spanned the 1890s to the 1920s. The movement primarily targeted political machines and their bosses. Okay, there was two things that they really wanted to do, and they were called progressivists. They wanted the government to play a more active role in solving society's problems with a focus to stop corruption and fix social problems, corporations, and the government. So they wanted to focus on several aspects of American society, not just one. So now we're going to talk about those major progressive reforms. There's a huge tragedy at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Okay, this company is a factory, for garments, so it's a lot of sewing. And mainly women work here. Well, there were no fire escapes. There were no safety precautions. And what ended up happening, in order to, it was dimly lit, so you had to use candles in order to produce light. Well, what happens is the whole building catches fire, and it's all made out of wood, and it's nothing but cloth, so it burns and flames in just minutes. And hundreds of women died from this fire because there were no safety precautions put in place. So, what happened as a progressive reform, we are now required to have fire escapes in buildings that are of a certain height. Okay, the next reform I want to talk about is there's a series of progressive presidents, which we'll talk about later this week, is we're going to be dealing with child labor. To enforce new laws against child labor, President Taft is going to found the Children's Bureau, pushing for certain age limits, just like right now we have child labor laws, as well as pushing them to go to education. Another thing is the suffrage movement, also known as the women's right to vote. Okay, the 19th Amendment is going to get passed. Other progressive movements include the Pendleton Act. It is a federal law enacted in 1883, which established that positions within the federal government should be awarded on the basis of merit instead of political affiliation. So that means people were getting jobs just because they were friends or they owed them a favor. So it would be like me saying, "Hey, Mr. Vels, do you want to be sheriff of Elizabethtown just because we're tight at school?" And me just giving it to him. He's had no education, he's had no training, no background, and that does not allow him to have the right, okay, to have that job with absolutely no history of doing it whatsoever. So everybody is now going to pass a civil service exam, as well as you have to have worked for it. You can't just get something. Another thing is the 17th Amendment, specifying that senators would be elected by the voters of each state. Prior to this, okay, the Electoral College, or the representatives and other governments, local governments, would choose who would represent you in the Senate. Okay, we had to have no say. We couldn't even elect or nominate somebody for the Senate. Another thing is to restore public confidence in the banking system. Woodrow Wilson supported the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. So it's a banking system where we could put our money into. Next is President Taft. Of course, we're going all around the spectrum with the presidents. We're going to talk about it more next week. We're going to learn about this guy named Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair is going to write the book The Jungle, talking about the Chicago meatpacking industry. Okay. And what happened in that industry, which you'll watch a video at the end of these notes, made Teddy Roosevelt throw up. It was aimed to hit the minds of the public, but it actually hit their stomachs. So Teddy Roosevelt, in an effort to make sure this would never happen again, is going to pass two acts, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, and they're pretty much exactly the same. So it's illegal to adulterate or misbrand meat and meat products being sold as food, and ensure that meat is slaughtered and processed under strict regulated sanitary conditions. People were not washing their hands. They were putting rat poison out, and rats would go eat the poison, and then they'd somehow end up in the churn. Now rats with poison are mixed up with the meat. People would take old, rotted, expired meat and mix it with the new meat and sell it. Okay, it was disgusting. Well, the Pure Food and Drug Act laid a foundation for the nation's first consumer protection agency, the Food and Drug Administration. So the FDA, where you have to label things, and you have to be supported, you have to be regulated in order to produce these kinds of food. Another one is the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. It advocated a ban on alcohol and distribution and sales. Okay, they ended up passing the 18th Amendment, meaning nobody anywhere could drink alcohol in all the United States of America. What ends up happening is that does get overturned until the 21st Amendment, the 21st Amendment, allowing everybody to have alcohol and letting states and local governments choose what they would do. So now getting to where we're going to talk about muckrakers. The muckrakers were reform-minded journalists in the Progressive Era in the United States who exposed established institutions and leaders as corrupt. They typically had large audiences in popular magazines. Okay, and McClure's magazine is an example of that. Right here is the ones we're going to be focusing on today, so let's get started. Let's talk about Thomas Nast. Okay, he created political cartoons to expose corruption. A lot of people in the 18 and 1900s, or late 1800s, early 1900s, could not read, but guess what they could do? Guess what they could do is expose corruption through pictures and images. Okay, the subject and focus brought attention to political corruption, specifically targeting Tammany Hall, the political machine ring. The result was Tweed was convicted of embezzlement and led to the creation of the secret ballot, where we now have private votes. We now have Jacob Riis, who is a journalist and a photographer that we looked at last week, talking about immigrants and their living conditions, and he does that in How the Other Half Lives. It brought to America's attentions of the living conditions of the urban poor, specifically exposing horrific conditions in tenement houses. It ultimately resulted in the New York City passed building codes to promote health and safety, known as the Tenement Act of 1901. Then we have Ida B. Wells, who wrote A Red Record, and the focus was to provide statistics on the lynchings of African Americans. It resulted in the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, to help pass anti-lynching legislation so people could not get beat anymore for things that they have done, specifically African Americans. Then you have Frank Norris, who wrote The Octopus, with a focus of fictional book that exposed railroads in California as monopolies taking advantage of people. In a court case of Northern Securities versus the United States, railroad monopolies in the Northwest were broken up. And, monopolies are where only one person controls a product. So that means because there's only one person controlling that product, they can make that as expensive as possible when it really is not realistic for Americans to pay for that. Then you have Ida Tarbell, who wrote The History of Standard Oil Company in McClure's magazine. And we're going to be looking at this photo in more detail tomorrow. It exposes the ruthless tactics of Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company through a series of published articles. The result of her work is in the court case Standard Oil versus the U.S., the company was declared a monopoly and broken up. So the thing about oil is if it is a monopoly, I want you to look at the octopus here. It has its arm wrapped around the Capitol. It has its arm wrapped around the White House. It has the arm wrapped around Congress. Okay. And big businesses were controlling politics because they controlled the money during this time, which is why monopolies we wanted to disband them because competition lowers prices, just like we've talked about in class. Next thing is Lincoln Steffens. He wrote The Shame of Cities. The focus examined political corruptions in cities across the United States. Results: cities began to use commissions and city managers instead of having, you know, party bosses or anything like that. Next is Upton Sinclair, the one that we've been talking about. He wrote The Jungle. He investigated and exposed horrid conditions at the meatpacking plant. Result: Teddy Roosevelt and the rest of America were disgusted. It led to the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act passed in 1906. So, what you're going to do now is you're going to watch a video clip about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Okay, you're going to describe the working conditions in the Chicago meatpacking plant using 5 examples. So I have put that link in your document. Just click the link, watch the video, and then that will be all that you're doing today. So please work on any missing work and turn this assignment when finished. Have a good day, guys.